Look at your skin for a moment. Whatever its shade, it contains a record of something that happened long before you were born. Not hundreds of years ago, not thousands, hundreds of thousands of years ago. Because human skin did not end up looking the way it does today by accident. Our ancestors carried one version of the human body into a changing world. Then, the world changed them. And the strange part is this. The force that helped shape the color of human skin was something every human being sees every single day: the sun. But here's the question. If sunlight was powerful enough to shape our skin, why didn't it make everyone the same color? Why are some populations much darker than others? Why did lighter skin become common in some parts of the world? And why didn't evolution simply choose one skin color and keep it? The answer begins with a problem our ancestors could not escape: radiation. Every day, sunlight reaches Earth's surface carrying ultraviolet radiation. You can't see it, you can't hear it, but your cells can feel its effects. Too much ultraviolet radiation can damage biological molecules and harm living tissue. So our ancestors needed protection, and one of the body's most remarkable solutions was already sitting inside the skin: melanin. Melanin is the pigment responsible for much of the variation we see in human skin color. But calling it simply a skin color pigment misses the bigger story. It is part of a biological defense system, and for humans living under intense ultraviolet radiation, having more protective pigmentation could be extremely useful, especially near the equator. This is where our story takes an unexpected turn. Because imagine what would happen if your ancestors lived under intense African sunlight for generation after generation, every day. The same environment, the same problem, the same evolutionary pressure. Individuals with traits that offered better protection were more likely to pass those traits on. Over enormous stretches of time, populations could become increasingly adapted to that environment. This does not mean evolution was trying to create a particular appearance. Evolution has no goal, no designer, no preference for one shade over another. It is simply a filter. Traits that help organisms survive and reproduce can become more common. Traits that are less useful can become less common. And sunlight was one of the environmental forces shaping that filter. But then something happened that changed the equation. Humans started spreading out of Africa, across new landscapes, toward regions where the sun did not behave the same way. And this is where the story gets interesting, because sunlight is not equally intense everywhere on Earth. Move toward higher latitudes, and the amount of ultraviolet radiation reaching the ground changes. Now imagine carrying a biological shield designed for intense sunlight into a place where sunlight is weaker. That shield is still protecting you, but another problem is appearing: vitamin D. Your body can produce vitamin D when ultraviolet B radiation reaches the skin, and vitamin D is important for normal bone development and other biological functions. So now our ancestors faced a strange evolutionary trade-off. Too much UV can be dangerous. Too little UV can also create problems. Suddenly, skin pigmentation was no longer just a question of protection. It was a balancing act. Protect the body, but still allow enough UV through for vitamin D production. And that balance changed depending on where humans lived. This is one reason skin color became one of the clearest visible examples of human adaptation. But here's the part people often get wrong. Human evolution did not work like this. Africa equals dark skin, Europe equals light skin, Asia equals something in between. It was never that simple. Real evolution is messier. Populations moved, they mixed, they adapted to different environments. Diet changed, genes changed, and the same visible trait could sometimes emerge through different genetic routes, which leads to one of the most fascinating discoveries in human genetics. Europe and East Asia both developed relatively light pigmentation, but they did not necessarily arrive there using exactly the same genetic changes. Think about that. Two populations faced somewhat similar environmental pressures, and evolution produced a similar visible result, using different pieces of the genetic machinery. That is called convergent evolution. Different paths, similar destination. It is one of the clearest reminders that evolution does not follow a single blueprint. There is no instruction manual saying, "Make humans lighter here." Instead, populations experience their own environments, and natural selection acts on the genetic variation available to them. Over many generations, small differences can become much more common, and eventually, a population can look very different from its distant ancestors. But there is another mystery. If human skin color evolved in response to environments, why don't we see only a few simple colors? Because the world itself isn't divided into a few simple environments. There are thousands of local conditions, different latitudes, different altitudes, different diets, different levels of UV radiation, different migration histories, different mixtures of populations, and different genetic variants. Human pigmentation is, therefore, not a set of three boxes. It is a spectrum, a continuous range produced by many interacting factors. And beneath that visible spectrum is something even more surprising: genes. Lots of them. Skin pigmentation is influenced by a network of genes involved in how melanin is produced, transported, packaged, and regulated. Some variants became important in particular populations. Others were shared across populations. Some changes appear to have been favored independently in different parts of the world. So when you look at two people with very different skin colors, you are not looking at two different versions of humanity. You're looking at two outcomes of the same species responding to different evolutionary histories. And that changes the way we should think about human skin. Because skin color is extremely visible. But visible does not mean fundamental. Our eyes notice pigmentation immediately. Our brains can turn that visible difference into categories almost instantly. Evolution does not work with those categories. It works with populations, genes, environments, reproduction, migration, and time. The boundaries we imagine between people are much cleaner than the biological history underneath them. And nowhere is this more obvious than when we look backward. Go far enough into human history, and today's familiar map of skin colors begins to disappear. The people living tens of thousands of years ago did not belong to the modern social categories we use today. Their populations were moving, separating, mixing, and adapting. And some traits that seem ancient may actually have become widespread relatively recently. That means something important. The human world we see today is not a finished product. It is a snapshot, a moment in an evolutionary process that is still much younger than most people realize. And there is an even bigger twist. The first modern humans were not walking around thinking about skin color. They had no concept of continents as we know them, no idea that humans would eventually live from the Arctic to the tropics, no idea that people thousands of generations later would have such different appearances. They were simply adapting to the environment immediately around them, the sun above them, the landscape beneath them, the food available to them, the threats around them, and the genes they inherited. That was enough. Then generations passed. A small genetic difference appeared. Another became common. A population moved. Another population stayed. The environment changed. The balance shifted. And slowly, very slowly, humanity began to look different in different parts of the world. Not because we became separate kinds of humans, because one species was repeatedly solving different environmental problems. And sunlight was one of the biggest of those problems. This also explains why the story cannot be reduced to one sentence like, dark skin evolved in Africa and light skin evolved in Europe. The real story is much more interesting. Human pigmentation has a deep African history, but pigmentation also continued evolving after humans spread into new environments. Different populations experienced different pressures. Different genetic variants rose in frequency, and some populations reached similar appearances through partly different evolutionary routes. So the color of human skin is not a simple paint job. It is a biological history book. Every shade represents a combination of ancestry, genes, environment, migration, and time. And there is one final question. If sunlight helped shape our skin, does that mean skin color tells us exactly where someone's ancestors came from? Not perfectly, because human populations have moved and mixed for thousands of years. Genes do not respect modern borders, and skin pigmentation itself is controlled by many genes, not one simple switch. A person's appearance can tell us something about evolutionary history, but it cannot tell us everything about their ancestry. That distinction matters, because the same visible trait can evolve in different populations. And people who look very different can still share most of their genetic history. The deeper we look, the less useful simple categories become, and the more fascinating the real story becomes. Because underneath every shade of human skin is the same basic biological machinery, the same species, the same evolutionary process, the same ancient origin. Different environments simply pushed that machinery in different directions. So the next time sunlight hits your skin, remember what you're actually looking at. You are not seeing a random color. You are seeing the result of an evolutionary compromise. Protection from ultraviolet radiation, the need to maintain important biological functions, the movement of humans across continents, genetic changes accumulating over generations, and hundreds of thousands of years of environmental pressure. The sun did not paint humanity different colors. It created the conditions, and evolution did the rest. One species left Africa. It entered different worlds, and slowly, generation by generation, its skin began recording the journey. That is why human skin comes in so many shades today. Not because humanity became many different kinds of people, but because one kind of human lived under many different suns. And beneath every shade, there is still the same story. One species, one ancient beginning, and a planet that kept changing the rules.